So on Sunday morning, we welcomed Brother Sam to Breckenash Church, and he preached there and took for his passages two things, one from 2 Corinthians and chapter 8, and focused in on the verses there on verse 9. For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that by his poverty you might become rich. Really interesting things going on in that passage. And then also from the gospel, the account where Jairus, the religious leader, approaches Jesus. It's Mark chapter 5 from 21 to the end. And Jairus's daughter is very poorly, even to the point of death. So he comes and begs Jesus, come and minister to my daughter. Maybe you could make her well. And so Jesus walks, and there's a crowd that follows him. And among the crowd, there's a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and she'd had lots of treatment under the doctors, physicians of the time. She'd spent all her money on the treatment, but rather than getting better, she'd actually got worse. And she'd heard about Jesus and thought, maybe he'll be able to help me. So she touched his cloak in hope of some healing, and the hemorrhages stopped. And Jesus turns and says to her, who touched me? I felt some power go out from me. And so he stops and has this encounter and this conversation with this lady, and just gives her attention. And then the message comes to him. It's too late now for Jairus' daughter. She's already died. And rather than lamenting the fact that he had tallied, Jesus says, no, we'll go and minister there as well, and reaches Jairus' daughter and raises her from the dead. So really interesting account of Jesus ministering to people's needs, giving people attention, having sufficient time despite what the circumstances might have said. And so Brother Sam reflected on some of that for us and began his talks by telling us a story of a young man named John. And that's where we begin, and I'll hand over to Brother Sam now.
A fortunate young man, because he had a nice way with him, he had friends, he had a lovely singing voice, he enjoyed life, and besides that, he was rich. His parents were rich, and his father indulged him. He could have anything that he wanted, really. Fine clothes, fine banquets, parties. He also had an ambition to become a soldier, to do well, to win fame and honour. His life was really very full. He seemed to have everything, and yet he wanted more. He wasn't sure what that was, but he wanted more. One day, when he was riding back to his home city, it was the days of 4-legged transport rather than 4-wheeled transport. He was riding along the road, and there in the road in front of him was a beggar asking for alms. And being a generous young man, particularly with his father's money, he reined in his horse and reached into his wallet, his purse, to hand the man a coin. But then suddenly drew back in horror, because he recognised that this wasn't an ordinary beggar. This man was a leper. And he had within him, since childhood, he'd had a deep fear of a revulsion of leprosy, a disease which infects the nerve ends, so that your flesh becomes, you don't feel anything, your flesh becomes wounded, it becomes full of pus, it smells. And in his day it was also believed to be a disease of the devil. Lepers were outcast. You kept away from lepers. And he was just about to spur on his horse to ride past the man, when the man reached out his hands, or stumps of his hands, and cried to him with the words, for the love of God, for the love of God. And those words went to the young man's heart. It was though in an instant he recognised how, out of love, God in Jesus Christ has come to share our life, to share our brokenness, our woundedness, our outcastness, has come to participate in it, to share it, and even to die for us. And he'd been brought up in religion and all that, but it's suddenly the truth of it struck him. And so instead of riding by, he gets down off his horse, and kneeling before the leper, he empties his wallet to him. And then he takes the man's hands, his rotting hands, and he kisses them and says to him, "Brother leper, brother leper." And then stands up and goes on his way. I've said the man's name was John, and it's true, he was baptized John, or Giovanni, because he was an Italian. But his mother was French, and he spoke French, and his friends nicknamed him Frankie, or Francesco, Francis of Assisi. And that meeting with a leper was the transforming engagement of Francis's life. He was never ever the same again. It revealed to him the love of God, the abundance of God's love for us, for everyone, for all creation. And from that time, he began to abandon his ambition. He left behind his rich clothes, fine clothes and fancy friends and extravagant way of life. He actually renounced his inheritance from his family, much to the dismay of his family. And he instead embraced the abundant generosity of God in Jesus Christ. We heard those words in the first reading today from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, in which he says, "For you know the generous act of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich." And those words really for Francis, they were a favourite text of Francis. They became the template of his life, the lens through which he saw the world and saw himself, those around him, and every creature, the whole of creation. It was the way he looked at the world. It was his world, became his worldview. And everywhere he looked, he saw the abundance of God, the unbelievable abundance of God, flowing from the fountain fullness of God's love. For Francis, every creature in its uniqueness was an expression of that limitless generosity of God. Not just beautiful creatures, not just the lovely fluffy ones which we all are drawn to, the rabbits and the lambs and the deer and so on. But no, the insignificant ones, the worms, the microbes, the ants, the crows, and of course people in the same way, the lepers, the outcasts, the forgotten, the humble ones. When speaking to one of his brothers, who was digging the garden, digging the vegetable patch, he said, "Brother, leave a place for the weeds, the wildflowers and weeds, because they have a place. They have a place. They also are an expression of the love of God, and they too give praise to God." I wonder if you recall the scenes at the beginning of the pandemic lockdown in March last year. The scenes of people struggling to fill up their supermarket trolleys with food and household goods in anticipation of the shortage, which this was going to be, which was expected through the lockdown. And there was actually one you might have seen it, a YouTube film of people fighting over toilet rolls, fighting in the supermarket over the, and of course the fear of shortage was self-fulfilling, because the hoarding created the scarcity as supermarkets shelves were swooped upon. Maybe that's rather an extreme example, but we often live with anxiety about scarcity. In fact, you could say that an anxiety of scarcity fuels our economy. It shapes our politics. It underpins our social lives. Will we have enough? The anxiety that we won't have enough. Won't have enough money. Well, all of us, I expect, worry about money from time to time. But you know, it's endemic in people. It's said that there was a survey of multimillionaires, and the majority of them said that actually they didn't think they had enough for their security, enough for their happiness. They wanted more. The anxiety about enough land or resources. So communities and nations arm themselves to the teeth to acquire more or to hang on to what they've got. And then, of course, perhaps all of us worry that we're not really good enough. We're not good enough, or attractive enough, or successful enough, or clever enough. FOMO, the fear of missing out. We all got in a bit, haven't we? And, you know, I mean, the advertising industry is built on that, you know, to persuading us that we need more to make us happy. And then perhaps deep down in us, I mean, there's the anxiety, understandable, but it's there. That we don't have enough days, that our days are numbered, because they are. We don't know how or when to say enough. That's actually the heart of the ecological crisis, the environmental crisis, the creation crisis that we're facing. We don't know how to say enough. We don't have a stop button. We always feel that we need more food, more resources, more experience, more security. But the secret which Francis of Assisi discovered, perhaps in that embrace of the leper on the road outside Assisi, was that less is more. That in order to experience the fountain fullness of God's love revealed in Jesus Christ, we need to let go. We need to give up the possessiveness and the acquisitiveness for status and self-image and all that which we surround ourselves to protect ourselves against scarcity, against not having enough. In order to experience God's abundant love and through all things, we have to make room. We have to make room for what is other than ourselves. We have to empty ourselves. We have to become poor in order to find out how rich we were. He was rich, yet for your sakes he became poor, so that through his poverty you might become rich. God is abundant richness because God gives God's self away, empties God's self to make room for us to share God's richness. It's counterintuitive, but it does work. That's what Francis discovered. That's what we discover the more we give away, the more we surrender territory, the more room we make for the other, for the stranger, for the outsider, for the migrant, for the one we fear, for the enemy we think we have. The more room that we find that we have within and for ourselves. The more we make room for the rest of creation, the more abundant the rest of creation becomes. I don't know if you remember, there's again also at the beginning of the lockdown, when the vast cruise liners stopped sailing into the lagoon in Venice, disgorging their 5,000 passengers to go and see the wonders and beauties of Venice. When they stopped, it took just 2 weeks for the dolphins to return. It almost as though they were waiting for the space to come back to their home. The more we live out of God's abundance, the more limitless the abundance becomes. Because God is a fathomless well of mercy and compassion and creativity and ingenuity and love. At the end of his life, Francis wrote a testament, and it began, a testament for his brothers and others, and it began by recounting that meeting in outside Assisi with the leper. And he begins with the words, when I was in sin, that's when I was living in possession of my life. When I was in sin, the Lord showed himself to me in this way. I thought that the sight of lepers nauseated me, he said. But he said, then the Lord himself led me among them. And what had been a source of angst and fright and fear for me became a source of sweetness. I love that story which we heard in the second reading, in the Gospel reading, the story of the woman who touches the hem of Jesus' garment. It's a little cameo story within a larger story, isn't it? I love it because there's Jesus, he's on his way to really big business. I mean, to Jairus, he's a big fellow in the local community. This is a really important meeting. And he's going to do something for him, for his daughter. It's urgent. And he's surrounded by people and pressing in upon him and lots of expectation. And yet, he has time within himself, he has space within himself to be attentive to and aware of this poor woman's need, this poor, shameful, hurting, longing woman. He's able to be alert to her and to know what's happening. And then this woman, this poor woman has to do love and compassion and healing and life and creativity, which is there in Jesus Christ. And it's there for us too.
So I'm sorry, there was a couple of little jumps there where the recording gear ran out of battery, but I think we got most of what Brother Sam was saying, and really encouraging, thought-provoking, challenging message. Simple, but something about a profound letting go of stuff in order to make room for the abundance of God and all that he offers us, and also something about having let go and received from God, and being made rich with the sort of prosperity that lasts into eternity, through the self-emptying, the Christ himself becoming poor for us so that we can receive his richness and abundance. And there's something in that about then having time sufficient for all that God calls us to be a blessing to others as well. Really thought-provoking, challenging, stuff there, and really grateful for Brother Sam's message to us.